Good afternoon and welcome to the European Literature Days 2020. I have to tell you once more, due to the corona pandemic, this year it's not possible to meet and interact with international writers here at the Klangraum Krems Minoritenkirche. I'm pleased to welcome you to the digital streaming of all our events and wish you an entertaining, inspiring and thought-provoking time with our think tank on the topic More Wilderness. And now I once more give the floor to Veronika, who will you accompany here on stage.
Well, thank you, Walter. Good afternoon, and welcome back to those who've been with us in the morning panels of Rosie Goldsmith and her guests. It's a very great pleasure for me to welcome you to the European Literature Days 2020 here at Klangraum Minoritenkirche Krems in Austria at Kunstmeile Krems. This is the fourth panel in which Rosie Goldsmith is going to talk to Nadia Bozak and Bettina Gappa. And before that, I would like to explain what I am here for. Well, actually, my name is Veronika Trubel, and I'm going to start and end today's panels from the place where the Literature Days originally take place. I might also report in case of technical topics arising, and I am the reporter for questions coming up from the audience. So, in case you would like to ask something, feel free to do so. You might do this either in the chat or per email. Our email address is literaturtage2020@gmx.net, and we're looking forward to what you want to ask or say. And now I'm really happy to say hello again to Rosie Goldsmith and welcome you and your guests. Hello.
Hi, Veronika, and thank you very much. I hope everybody had a nice lunch wherever they are. And I'm delighted to be back for, in fact, my third panel today, which is another aspect of wilderness and how our writers are writing about wilderness and how they're living in it quite often too. It's been a fascinating morning, but this afternoon is an absolutely essential and very important topical topic. We're going to be talking about who defines wilderness. And we're going to look at this particularly from historical aspect, because at the moment we've possibly been too Eurocentric about it. There are so many different ways of defining wilderness. Now, I'm joined this afternoon by the Zimbabwean writer Bettina Gappa and the Hungarian writer Gergely Péterfi. So join me. There they are, both there. One is close to Budapest, that's Gergely. And Bettina, you're actually in Zimbabwe. So very exciting to welcome you from there. I'm crossing my fingers the Wi-Fi holds up, that everything is but it's been quite a miracle that we've actually made all these connections around the world today. It's quite extraordinary, because we were in the Isle of Mull earlier, and I know you know Scotland very well, don't you, Bettina, too? So and now
yes, thank you so much. This is wonderful. I have to warn you that I'm not actually in the wilderness, but I might be in something of an online wilderness, because our internet here is a little bit unreliable. So as you said, anything may happen, but I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Rosie.
And Gergely, where exactly are you? You're not exactly in Budapest, are you?
No, I'm on an island in the middle of the Danube, north from Budapest. It's called Szentendre Island. And it's a beautiful place, and I have two Danubes, one on the right and one on the left.
Oh, that's just greedy. I love the Danube. In fact, you know, if in real life we'd almost be next to the Danube now anyway for this event. Now, what we're going to be talking about with both Gergely and Bettina are listening to their very radical approaches, I think, and essential questions about how we look at this so far sort of dominant Eurocentric idea about wilderness and civilization. Now, Gergely's novel, Der ausgestopfte Barbar, The Stuffed Barbarian, is our main focus for this afternoon. And Bettina Gappa's Aus der Dunkelheit strahlendes Licht, Out of Darkness, Shining Light, which we do have in English. Unfortunately, Gergely's book hasn't been translated into English yet. It's a very big, thick German novel. I don't know whether that's putting off the translators, but hopefully it will one day be translated into English. And so I want to ask both of them over the next hour and a bit, how do they think and write about wilderness and what it means to them? Now we're going to start off with Bettina, and we're going to talk about Bettina's book. We're going to talk about Bettina, and then Gerge will be listening quietly in the background as we discuss Bettina and her novel as well. So thank you for the moment, Gerge. Bettina, there you are, sitting in Zimbabwe. I know you weren't born exactly in Zimbabwe, you were born in Zambia, but you are Zimbabwean. So tell us about your early life and how you've made this full circle. You're back in Zimbabwe, because I know that as a lawyer, an international lawyer, you've lived in many major European cities, and you've traveled so much, but here you are back in Zimbabwe.
Thank you so much for pointing out that I was born in Zambia, because it's a tiny biographical detail that not many people get, but I'm very proud to have been born in Zambia. It wasn't my choice, but I always say it gave me a sort of an itinerant spirit, because I love travel, I love living in different countries. And it also means that I'm one of the very few Zimbabweans who were born in independent African soil, because I was born in 1971 when my country was still Rhodesia. And then when I was about 9 months, my parents moved back to Zimbabwe. My father moved with his bank, which was Barclays Bank. He was a cashier, very, very humble job. But he managed to raise 5 children. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters, all younger than me. I was the eldest, and I was expected to be the family example. I was expected to achieve, to get all the good grades. So I was the first person in my family to go to university across every generation you can think of. And my brothers and sisters followed in my footsteps. But I knew very early on that I wanted to live in Europe. And I knew very early on that I wanted to do international law. So after I finished my law degree at the University of Zimbabwe, I was offered a postgraduate degree opportunity in Austria, Österreich, yeah? And I immediately snapped it up. And in Austria, my law degree was considered equivalent to the Magister. So I was able to do the Doktorarbeit work immediately. So I did my Juris Doctor at the University of Graz, which I really love. And in between, I took a break to go to the University of Cambridge to do a master's, came back. And by the time I was 26, I had a PhD. And then I moved to Switzerland to become an international trade lawyer, which is the subject I'd written about. And at the same time, I've always wanted to be a writer. So I had a mini life crisis when I was about 32 or so, and that's when I started writing. So I'm very fortunate now to inhabit these 2 worlds that I love, which is the world of international trade and the world of writing. That's my biographical details in a nutshell.
Well, you do it much better than Wikipedia. So I think it's always better to ask the writer themselves how they describe their background, because you know it's really interesting if you give the long list of everything that you've done and the numbers of prizes and all you've written, all the different places you've lived in. It is phenomenal, Bettina. I mean, what an interesting life. You know, from everything you've described, you should be at least 100, everything you've lived.
I've been 100.
Well, anyway, so let's talk about the writing life then, because as you say, you had that moment when you realized that's what you wanted to do. Now, I mean, you've written, I mean, the books that I know about, I've got Elegy for Easterly, short story collections, your first in 2009, but you've been writing before that, haven't you?
Yes, I mean, I've always written, I think. I mean, from the moment I understood where books come from, which is that there's a conscious mind behind the words that I love to read. And so from about 10 or 11, I was scribbling stories I wrote, and I used to draw as well. So I used to illustrate my own books. I used to write nonsense poetry to amuse my brothers and sisters, because we loved Ogden Nash and Hilaire Belloc. And I love science fiction. And one of my famous books, which I hope will be a proper book one day for children, is called Return to Planet Earth. And it's about a penal colony on Mars. And I had an exclamation mark in the title, Return to Planet Earth. And it was about these prisoners who are sent to the penal colony on Mars, and then they built a rocket and they plot their revenge and they plot their return to planet Earth, you know. So I was very influenced by what I read. I loved history, I loved science fiction, I loved nonsense poetry. And what was really interesting, Rosie, is that none of the books I read as a child, because I had a very Rhodesian childhood, featured Black people, unless they were King Solomon's mines, right? So people traveling through the wilderness to try and, you know, find treasure, King Solomon's mines and so on. So I had a very warped childhood in many ways until I got to the age of 12, when my first Black teacher gave me Things Fall Apart and The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born and other novels by African authors. And that really expanded my world, because for the first time, I could actually see myself in what I was reading, and it really shifted things for me.
So Things Fall Apart, which I think, you know, as you say, for you was life-changing, Chinua Achebe, for many of us, I think too. And, you know, I grew up partly in Zimbabwe and South Africa, and you know, I must say that to this day, I am making up for lost time in a way by reading as much as I can about, you know, things I wasn't exposed to as a child. And I think that, you know, what you've done with your novels, instinctively, you've reversed, instinctively, but also very deliberately, it seems to me, you've reversed that perception. And if we look at your other, Elegy for Easterly was your first published novel. I know you've written a lot before then. Then The Book of Memory, 2015, and then Rotten Row, and then what I call Shining Light, which is the shorthand for your novel, which has been translated into English and and it's written in English and translated into German. Aus der Dunkelheit strahlendes Licht, Out of Darkness Shining Light. Now, that book particularly is the one we want to focus on. And you've, even though it was In Speech Marks only published last year, this is a book that took you many years to write. Many, many long years of experience went into this book, and an obsession, it seems to me, that started as a child with David Livingstone. Now, tell us about your obsession. Tell us why this book is so important to you.
Thank you so much, Rosie. So I consider myself a writer with the central mission to decolonize the stories of my country and my continent. And it doesn't look like my books are linked, but they are linked in that mission. So I started writing at a time when the Zimbabwe story was the story of the land invasions and the story of the white farmers. And there were some wonderful books, Peter Godwin's Kiwa, Alexandra Fuller, which I loved. But the problem wasn't with the books, it was with the reception, right? Because what it meant, because unfortunately, the Western media has only time for one kind of story. So what it meant was that increasingly, the story of Zimbabwe was being seen as the story of the white farmer, whereas there was so much going on. There was so much going on. What about the farm workers? What about trade unionists? You know, what about the Black majority of Zimbabwe that first experienced the negative burden of colonialism, and now we're experiencing the negative burden of one-party rule? So it was to decolonize that story that I started writing about ordinary people caught up in the extraordinary political circumstances in Zimbabwe. And then when it came to the Livingstone story, this was a straight out, easily identifiable decolonization project, because the companions of David Livingstone did something very extraordinary after he died. They decided to carry his body to the coast so that it could be buried in England. And when the story was told in Victorian England and in subsequent books, it was always the story of Livingstone, that there was something in him, something fine and noble, that inspired these almost noble savages to carry out an act of faith. But I wanted to find out what on earth happened? Why did they do it? What were their reasons for it? And what was that journey like? So I wanted to flip the story of Victorian exploration by looking at it from the perspective of the Black men and women who carried the body of the white man. So it was like, a sort of a Black savior narrative rather than the typical white savior narrative.
Well, I mean, it is quite an extraordinary story. And in fact, we're not just talking about a few people who carried the body or just a few weeks. We're talking about one of the most extraordinary expeditions that ever took place. Now, Livingstone's body was carried, I think it took about 9 months, didn't it, to get his body, with 70 different people on the expedition, taking that body out of the interior of Africa to end up in Britain for burial. And this was 1873. So, I mean, I can imagine an amazing amount of research. And you tell me about the research.
It was indeed, Rosie, an amazing amount of research, because it was actually meant to be my first novel. I have a little talisman that I carry, which is my floppy disk from 1998, which I actually first developed the idea in Austria when I was, bored with my PhD studies, and I thought, oh, let me write a novel. And so I sort of started thinking about this idea of flipping the narrative, but I knew absolutely nothing about Victorian expedition. I knew absolutely nothing about who these people were, except that I knew there was a Chuma, a Susi, and a Jacob Wainwright. But I couldn't imagine that only 3 people carried the body. So I spent the next 20 or so years, not only writing, but also finding out. I am now an amateur expert on Victorian expedition. Rosie, you and I and Gege and everybody, I can mount an expedition for us. We can go to search for the source of the Nile. And I'll tell you exactly how to do it, because I learned so much about how the explorers moved, the kind of products that they traveled with as they traded across Africa. I learned about the large villages in which they traveled, because in Livingstone's last journey, there were at least 70 people. And gloriously, there were women. There were women in these expeditions. So they were not only male sort of expeditions, there were children. People would stop and rest for 3 months at a time. So they would actually effectively build little villages. They picked up languages, they traded. And to me, it was really just the most wonderful immersion into what to me was an extraordinary world.
Did it, in the end, and we're going to hear a reading in a few seconds, but did it in the end achieve what you wanted it to do, which was to refocus the narrative?
It really did. It really did in ways that have continued to astonish me. I mean, on my continent, in Africa, in Nigeria, in Kenya, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, is being received extremely well, because of course people want to know the African perspective on what the Europeans considered the wilderness, the dark continent, right? And in Europe itself, in Germany, I'm happy to say in Austria, it's publishing in France very soon, in Norway, people are really interested, especially in the wake of Black Lives Matters. People are really interested in the decolonization project. And Rosie, I have to tell you that one of the most exciting things that's happened to me is that I'm going to be working with the David Livingstone Museum, the place he was born, to write on the legacy of David Livingstone from an African perspective.
Oh,
so
that's amazing. That's amazing. See, that's it. You've achieved that already. So and that's almost like your childhood dream, I recall, because you wanted to discover the source of the Nile, didn't you, as a child? So you are an explorer, and you've arrived almost at your destination. That's so great. Bettina, thank you for that. Let's hear your reading from Shining Light, as I'm calling it, the shorthand title, and here it is coming up.
Hello, I'm Bettina Gappa. I'm going to read the prologue of my latest novel, Out of Darkness, Shining Light. This is how we carried out of Africa the poor broken body of Bwana Daudi, the doctor, David Livingstone, so that he could be borne across the sea and buried in his own land. For more than 1,500 miles from the interior to the eastern coast, we marched with his body, from Chitambo to Wanamuzungu, from Chisalamala to Kumbakumba, from Lambalamfipa to Tabora, until 285 days after we left Chitambo, we reached Bagamoyo, that place of sorrow, whose very name means to lay to rest the burden of your heart. We set him down in the hushed peace of the church, and all through that long night prayed and sang and keened the 700 manumitted slaves from the village of the free. After the tide came in the following day, they lined up on either side of the path that led to the dhow of his final crossing. And we watched until the white sail of that rickety wooden boat was a small dark triangle on the far horizon, and all that we could see of him was the sky meeting the shimmering sea. He gave up his life to the doomed, demented search for the last great secret of that heaven-descended spring, the world's longest river. He gave his all to uncover the secret that had preoccupied men of learning for more than 2,000 years, the source of the Nile. In the final 2 years of his life, both before and after he was relieved in Ujiji by the American Bwana Stanley, he was as a man possessed. In every town and village and hamlet through which we passed, Bwana Daudi asked the same question. Had any person seen or heard of a place where 4 fountains rose, 4 great fountains that rose out of the ground between 2 hills with conical tops? They were the fountains described in ancient times by a long-dead sage called Herodotus, he said, from the far-off land of Greece. To find these fountains, he believed, was to find the source of the Nile. When they asked to know what this Nile was, he said it was the world's longest river, but more than a river, it was a miracle of creation, splendid beyond comprehension. Bwana Daudi was certain that these fountains linked to 4 great rivers that he knew already, those of Kafue, Lomame, Luapula, and Zambezi. Herodotus, he said, had written that water from these fountains flowed in 2 directions, with half going up to Egypt and the other half flowing south. And thus it was that we followed the southwards flow of the Luapula into the swamps of Bangweulu. But there, instead of finding the headwaters of the Nile, in the village of Chitambo, Bwana Daudi found his death. He is as divided in death as he was in life. His bones lie now in his own land, entombed in the magnificence of ancient stone. In the grave we dug for him, under the shade of a mvula tree, his heart and all the essential parts of him are at one with the soil of his travels. The grave of his bones proclaims that he was brought over land and sea by our faithful hands. The wise men of his age say he blazed into the darkness of our natal land to leave behind him a track of light where the white men who followed could go in perfect safety. This is all we 69 have ever been in his world, the 69 who carried his bones, the dark companions, his dark companions, the shadowy figures in the caravans in which he moved. We were only ever the pagazi on his journeys, the porters and bearers who carried his loads and built his huts and cooked his meals and washed his clothes and made his beds, the askari who fought his battles, his loyal and faithful retinue. On the long and perilous journey to bring him home, 10 of our party lost their lives. There are no stones to mark the places where they rest, no epitaphs to announce their deaths. And when we who remain follow where they led, no pilgrims will come to show their children where we lie. But out of that great and troubling darkness came shining light. Our sacrifice burnished the glory of his life. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Bettina Gappa, very much indeed for that reading. And if you haven't read her book, you must. And I order you to, here and now, in any language. And Bettina, we'll hear from you in about 15 minutes. I know that you're going to sit back and listen as George Petefe and I have a chat about his book as well. So thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie.
George Petefe, welcome to you properly and in full Technicolor glory. There you are as well. And the light is shining.
I tried my best.
The shining light on your head. I think that's...
Yes, I cannot do against it nothing. So sorry. I tried it many times, but it's over.
It's all about it's all about shining lights today. It's very dark out here where I'm living, so you can just see my light is slightly orange at the moment, but it's because it's outside. But anyway, I apologize for all kind of strange lighting we might have. Ngage, we're here to talk about your novel, which in English is called The Stuffed Barbarian, Der ausgestopfte Barbar, but it's not actually, it hasn't appeared in English yet. Now, you wrote this about 5 years ago, I think, quite a while ago. Tell us about, this book has made a big impact on a lot of people. It's a very, following on from Bettina's stories as well about trying to reverse the colonial approach, the Eurocentric approach to African history. You've done it as a European, but you've done exactly the same thing. And you know, it is quite an extraordinary story. You're in the 18th century. Bettina was in the 19th century with David Livingstone. Tell us the story of who is the ausgestopfte Barbar, the stuffed barbarian, and what's your story?
The stuffed barbarian is called Angelo or Angelo Soliman. He was born in the beginning of the 18th century in Middle Africa on the west coast. We don't know exactly where was his country and where lived his tribe. And he was brought to Europe by Portuguese shipmen, Portuguese slave
Owners?
Yes, and was brought to Sicily and was given as a gift to the governor of the Habsburg Empire in Sicily, to Prince Lobkowitz. And he was at that time about 7 years old boy. And Lobkowitz used him as an object of an experience. If an African boy can learn the European sciences, the European languages, the European music, European anything you want. And of course, he could do it. And at the end of the experience, there were...
sorry to interrupt. I think you mean experiment.
Experiment.
Yeah.
The experiment at the end of this experiment, he was a 17 years old guys who spoke Latin and ancient Greek and could play on piano and knew the astronomy and mathematics and many languages. So it was a very strange phenomenon in the European scene. And after the war with the Spanish Habsburgs, with Lobkowitz, he went to Vienna, and in Vienna he became one of the most celebrated personalities of the Viennese society because he was a kind of miracle, a kind of curio, a kind of freak. So it was a very interesting situation, and he became Freemason, and he was a friend of Mozart and many of the Viennese society scholars and writers and musicians. And one of them was a Hungarian poet. His name was Ferenc Kazinczy, and Ferenc Kazinczy was a Freemason too. And as a Freemason, he went to Vienna to get know other Freemason in the lodge of Vienna, and there they became friends with Angelo Soliman. And it was a hidden story for centuries in Hungary. Ferenc Kazinczy, but in Vienna it is a well-known story. In Vienna, Angelo Soliman is a well-known name. But in Hungary, nobody knew this fantastic friendship. And Ferenc Kazinczy wrote 20 volumes of correspondence. It's a huge correspondence with the other poets of the age and writers and so on. And when I was 25, I decided to read this terrible book, 20 volumes of correspondence.
I was going to ask you whether you had read all.
Yeah, it was a terrible idea.
Yes.
It was a terrible idea, of course.
You started at the age of 20 and finished 20 years later.
I was crazy. But in the third volume, I found a letter of Angelus Soliman to Ferenc Kazinczy, and the letter of Ferenc Kazinczy to Angelus Soliman. And in the back page, in the verso of the letter, Ferenc Kazinczy wrote the short story of his friend, that his friend Angelo, after his death in the beginning of the 18th century in 1810, was stuffed and was exhibited in Vienna in the Museum of in the Natural Historical Museum, and the story begins here because Ferenc Kazinczy participated in the Jacobean revolt in the end of the 18th century, and because of it, he was judged to prison. First, he was judged to death for beheading, and he thought that he will be beheaded. But in the last moment, the emperor gave him a possibility to go to prison, and he went to prison for 7 years. And after he came out from the prison, Angelo has died and was stuffed, and Ferenc Kazinczy went to the museum to visit his old friend. And this is the moment where my novel begins, because after Kazinczy's death, Kazinczy's wife goes to the museum and stands before the stuffed body of her husband's best friend, and tells him to the body the story of their life.
Wow.
And because Sophie Török and Ferenc Kazinczy, they lived extraordinary life in Hungary. They tried to live in a way that in Western Europe live the intellectuals. And he lived in a very underdeveloped country in the northeastern part of Hungary. And they tried to live the life of an enlightened family, of an enlightened European intellectual family. But it ended, this experiment ended terribly. They lost all their money, they lost their house, and they lost everything. And at the end, Ferenc Kazinczy died in the cholera pandemic. In the cholera pandemic, was a very serious one in the beginning of the 19th century, and it wiped away in Europe and killed millions. And this is a novel of a pandemic too. This is a novel of experiment to live an enlightened life in Eastern Europe. And this is a story of an African guy who was an object of an experiment and became a celebrated man, and after his death became a stuffed object of curiosity and mock and fun and other terrible things.
Yeah, I mean, that is, I don't even know where to begin. There is so much in that book, and I do hope that we do have it translated into English. I hope it doesn't take somebody 20 years to get to it. It's a remarkable story. It's an incredibly upsetting story as well. I mean, you've spoken about experiments, experiments that human beings not only conduct, but they conduct on other people. I mean, it's so shocking. And, and of course, it wasn't the only case similar, there are other similar cases, of course, which came out later as well. The story of how you managed to combine the European and the African stories in this one story written by several narrators as well. I mean, that again in itself is a great achievement, to bring all these different threads together. How long did it take you to write this book?
It took 10 years because first of all, when I found this story, I was very young, and I felt that I am unable to write it. It's so a huge topic. I have to read a lot, and I have to travel a lot, and I went to Vienna with a scholarship, and I went to read the archives in Haus, Hof- und Staatsarchiv in Vienna. So I researched years and collected the documents of the life of Angelo Soliman and the life of Ferenc Kazinczy and the life of the Viennese Freemasonry and documents of Freemasonry in Vienna and many fantastic documents. At the end, I had huge hills in my room of documents and copies. So I decided then to forget everything and start it from the beginning and write it as a fiction novel. So I read a lot, I researched a lot, and I wrote a mix of documentary and fiction in the novel. So it took more than 10 years.
I mean, it is, as you say, it's based on a true story, and it's your discovery of that story that made you write it. Has anybody else written about this?
Yes. For example, one of our favorite German writer, Musil, in their Mann ohne Eigenschaften, writes some pages about Angelo Soliman, and there are several literary works which depict the figure of Soliman. As I told, in Vienna, he's a very well-known story. The story of Angelo Soliman, the stuffed African. It's a big. It's a very. It's a kind of shame and a kind of bizarre, grotesque stories of Vienna. Vienna is is full with grotesque and bizarre and dark stories. This is one of the darkest.
Let's hear a reading from the novel, and we'll talk about it with Bettina afterwards. Thank you, Gary, so much.
Thank you so much.
Angelo war 20, der Fürst 54, als sicher war, eine fast vollkommene Kopie seiner selbst hergestellt zu haben, die dieselben Bücher las, dieselbe Musik spielte und dieselben mathematischen Formeln kannte wie er. Sie entschlüsselten die umfängliche Partitur des Messias von Händel, mit einer Hand die Töne auf dem Klavier suchend. Die Besonderheit der Partitur war, dass sie von der Hand des Londoner Meisters selbst stammte. Der Fürst erstand den Schatz gemeinsam mit Willibald Gluck, dem Sohn seines Försters in London. Sie unternahmen die lange Reise allein deswegen, und es gab keinen Tag, an dem er sich nicht für 1-2 Stunden darin vertiefte. Das mächtige Notenbuch lag zur Hälfte im Schoß des Fürsten und halb in dem Angelos, und während sie es mit einer Hand hielten, suchten sie mit der freien Hand die Töne auf den Tasten des Klaviers. Um eine vollere Harmonie zu erzielen, stellten sie sich die einzelnen Partien der Instrumentengruppen vor. Sie imitierten sie auch, wobei Lobkowitz am liebsten die Bläser nachmachte. Er blies die Luft aus den gespitzten Lippen oder durch die Faust, wie bei einer Trompete, und Soliman übernahm die Streicher und den Chor. Wollte der Fürst lesen, bat er Angelo, ihm vorzulesen. Die tiefe Stimme mit dem seidigen Klang beruhigte ihn. Die weisen Gliedsätze aus Ciceros Briefen oder Senecas satanische Sinnsprüche passten dazu hervorragend. Sie beugten sich stundenlang über den Geländetisch, um mit den Zinnsoldaten die Schlachten von Cannae, Philippi oder Karthago oder was sie gerade bei Livius oder Herodot gelesen hatten, nachzustellen. Über den Geländetisch gebeugt, konnte der Fürst seine Vorliebe für geometrische Formationen voll ausleben. Sie stellten das Relief des Geländes nach der Beschreibung her, und hatte der Fürst in seinem Fundus keinen Hügel von geeigneter Form oder nicht genügend Bäumchen für einen dichten Wald, so schnitt Angelo umgehend ein paar Berge aus Kartonpapier und Säckleinwand aus oder er stellte Bäume aus Holzstäbchen mit Rosshaar her. Für die Schlachten Hannibals setzte der Fürst, um Angelo eine Freude zu machen, schwarz angemalte Zinnsoldaten mit Lanzen in der einen und einem Stachelstock in der anderen Hand auf die Elefanten. Manchmal schoben sie die Soldaten bis zum frühen Morgen auf dem Spieltisch umher, und der Fürst analysierte die Entscheidungen der Heerführer mit seiner vom Rotwein angeheizten Fantasie, bis er zu guter Letzt in einem vollkommen anderen Verlauf für die Schlachten schuf. Er liebte einzig und allein diese miniaturisierte, leicht zu formende, geruchs- und geräuschlose Version des Krieges. Da war aber noch eine Variante, für die er zu entflammen war, und dafür brauchte er weder Geländetisch noch die Geschichte, das Schachspiel. Er studierte morgens mit Angelo das Schachbuch des François-André Deniken-Philidor, und sie kontrollierten den französischen Meister Schritt für Schritt, ob er nicht irgendwo in seinen Spielanalysen gemogelt hatte. Angelo hielt das Buch in der Hand, weil der Fürst um jeden Preis nachweisen wollte, so viel zu können wie dieser dahergelaufene Musiker, und er versuchte mit knirschenden Gehirnwindungen herauszufinden, welche Züge der Autor sich wohl für die folgende Runde ausgedacht hatte. Für Soliman war dieses Ritual kompliziert und beschwerlich. Es war für ihn eine Gratwanderung, dass er Lobkowitz die Lösung nachbrachte, es aber nicht offenkundig werden durfte, dass die richtige Antwort letztlich nicht dem Kopf des Fürsten entstammte.
Thank you, Gergely Petitfils. Thank you very much for that reading.
Thank you, Rosie.
And you're in the same room, but in a different place. different now, what you've both introduced are such strong, overwhelmingly powerful stories and also viewpoints, I think. And I need both of you, I'd love both of you to sort of react to each other's stories, if we could. Bettina, first of all, you've heard the story from Gergely. Tell me how you feel about that story. What are your immediate reactions?
Thank you so much, Rosie. And Gergely, I have to say that my immediate reaction is one of wonder and also gratitude. Wonder because it must have been an extraordinary amount of work to bring out the story, all the research you did, looking into the archives, and also really gratitude because I said to you during the break that this really is a decolonization project. And I love that there are so many of us writers from different countries who are looking at the past with fresh eyes, with decolonized eyes, and looking at the stories of, looking from the perspective that I call the subaltern perspective. Instead of looking at the generals, let's look at the foot soldiers, let's look at the ordinary men and women. And two things that really struck me as you were talking, Gege, is this idea of a person being given as a gift, especially a child being given as a gift. And we're talking here about wilderness. And the people who made these gifts to each other consider themselves civilized, but that really is the wilderness, really. That is the law of the jungle. And then you contrast that with the humanity with which Livingstone's companions buried his body. They took out his insides, his heart, and they gave a decent Christian burial as far as they could in Africa, and they took his body home. So you just contrast the humanity with which then this body was then displayed as an exhibit. And there have been so many stories of Africans, Indians, people of color throughout history who've been displayed, whose bodies have been displayed as curiosities. So to me, I just thought that was absolutely wonderful, because I think the decolonization project is not just the work of Black writers. I think it's the work of all writers who have an interest in a more compassionate take on history. Thank you so much, Gege.
Thank you.
Gege, I'll ask you the same as well to respond to Bettina's story, and also to pick up, first of all, is whether you ever felt any enhanced responsibility or even guilt at writing this story as a white male Hungarian writer and not as an African.
Yeah, it was a very hard question, and I questioned myself many times if I had the right to write this story, and at the end I answered yes, because I had the possibility to research it. I had the perspective to write a story of people who don't have the possibility to tell this story in that time, because they hadn't the language for this story. Ferenc Kazinczy, who wrote down this story in a short letter, it was the most fascinating and most fantastic story of his life. It was the friendship in his life, and he couldn't write it because he hadn't the language to write about an African people who was his friend. It was impossible to write it in the 19th or the 18th century. So I had the possibility to write it instead of him or them. And the other about Bettina's novel, it's fantastic, and it's a very important task for us writers to turn up the perspective of the stories of even of the past, not only of the present, and to watch from another perspective and write it from another perspective, the narrative, the big narratives of the colonial tradition, of the European literary tradition, write it from the perspective of the others, for the European, of the Africans, of the slaves, of people who hadn't have the right or the language to tell or write their own story.
And if we, Bettina, go ahead.
I was just going to echo what Gege said, and also just raise a slightly contested point, not just slightly contested, but actually hugely contested point, which is this idea of cultural appropriation. Now, I am firmly of the view that you cannot talk about cultural appropriation when it comes to fiction, because in fiction, we are living in the world of the imagination. And so if we talk about write what you know or write who you are, then really all we have left is memoir. So I'm a huge believer in the imagination. I want to write the stories of everyone I can imagine. I want to write in the voice of men. I want to write in the voice of Europeans. I want to write in the voice of, I've got a novel that I'm working on right now, which is about a Jewish refugee from Vienna, who ends up on one of Eichmann's trains, the Kindertransport, and he finds himself establishing a law firm in Rhodesia. I wanted to write those stories because I think those stories are important. Because for me, what binds us and what unites us matters more than what divides us. But I do take the point that some people believe that certain people should not write certain stories. But I really want to say that I think that how you tell the story, with what compassion, with what humanity, how well you do your research, how well you imagine your characters, to me matters more, I think, than who you are as a writer.
Although, of course, that's not the only view, but as we know, it's a very, as you say, very contested issue, the idea of cultural appropriation now, because so many stories are coming out. You mentioned Black Lives Matter at the beginning, Bettina. It is an extraordinary time, and we've been in this pandemic period, and all this is coming out now. And we've got great writers, great Black writers who, for the first time, are being heard and being published. I mean, do you see it as a good time for Black writers, or do you see it as simply something that was, it was going to happen, that should have happened ages ago? How do you rate this current period?
Yeah. So something happened last night that was quite wonderful. There had been a lot of carping over the last year about the Booker Prize, about how, this was the most diverse, and by diverse, people really mean Black. This was the most diverse list to date, and all the judges are really diverse, meaning they're majority Black and brown, right? And then last night, they crowned the winner, who is a white man from Scotland.
Not only that, he's white and openly gay and married.
Openly married and from Scotland. And I think people were relieved because I think they thought, oh, well, maybe diversity didn't matter so much to them. But hello, this is the second ever Scot in the history of the Booker Prize to win it. And he's a gay man, that is incredibly diverse. And this idea that Black people can only promote other Black people is hugely offensive because, professional judges enjoy reading literature. We enjoy reading literature from everywhere. Writers enjoy reading literature from everywhere. Hey, some of my best friends are white. I'm going to pick up Gege's book. I'm going to try and read it in German. It might take me longer than it would in English, but I'm definitely going to, because I'm now really interested. But I really think that personally, my focus is good writing. And of course, I'm delighted that the Black Lives Matters movement means that marginalized voices are now being heard. But marginalization is not just about race. It's also about class. It's about gender identification. It's about sexual orientation. It's about whether you're from a little Austrian town called Krems that nobody really knows, and you've got a wonderful story to tell, but maybe the opportunities go to writers in Vienna. I mean, diversity has so many layers depending on where we're speaking from. I'm going to stop talking now because if I don't, I could go on forever.
We're very happy to listen to you. But Gage, it's a really interesting point. I think that, all our countries, are now finally embracing, maybe at some point we won't even use the word diversity, it's just life. And I'm wondering how you see that from Hungary, and how it's seen from Austria as well. Is this a good time? Are you embracing this diversity? There is no other word I can find at the moment.
I think it's every time a good opportunity to do it, but this pandemic gave us the opportunity to view our lives and others' life in a very new light, and we experience a collectiveness we never experienced before. The community of fear, the community of instability. Maybe many centuries ago, people felt the same constantly in historical times when pandemics and wars came, and you never knew if you can wake up tomorrow or not. I think now we can feel something deeper human in this pandemic ages, and I hope that after these dark months, we can wake up with open mind.
Absolutely. I think this has been a moment where we can just think. Now, you know, to the topic of wilderness, which you're, you know, we're also addressing very, very broadly, I think, in this discussion. What you've both described are both the dark side and the positive side of wilderness. Is wilderness for you something negative, or is it positive?
I think for me now in Eastern Europe, mainly in Hungary, it's something negative. There are forces that are to be tamed. And
you're talking about human forces, or are you talking about
human forces, inner forces, wilderness at heart, wilderness in the heart, and wilderness in the mind. And I think something wild happened in Eastern Europe, and this kind of wilderness, I think, has to be stopped. But we promised we don't talk about politics.
Well, if it's politics you're referring to, then you may need to give a little bit more. I mean, you're very general about it, Eastern Europe. I think possibly you could say the whole of the world has had to deal with some very negative, wild forces. Now, how do you, Bettina, see that question? Is wilderness for you something negative, or is it positive?
Look, I think wilderness can be positive or negative. Sorry to be so to equivocate a little bit, but in my novel, my concern was to contest the idea of an entire continent as wilderness, right? To contest the idea of an entire continent as a place of darkness. So in a way, I was kind of writing back to Conrad. Out of darkness, shining light, heart of darkness. And this idea of wilderness in the Victorian imagination was a place without civilization. And what I wanted to show, not only through the acts of the very human acts of the companions, but also the people that they met. Yes, it was a very dark time. The slave trade, the East African slave trade was going on. But there was so much kindness, there was so much humanity. That they encountered. They went into towns, they went into villages, they were offered hospitality. So it was really to sort of like show that what was considered a wilderness is actually a place of civilization, because guess what? As I said earlier in my response to Gege's lovely conception of a novel, the wilderness was also on the other side, right? The people who were so willing to debase other human beings that they gave them to each other as gifts, sold them as chattel, you know, when they were dead, they, you know, gave them no dignity even in death. They continued to be experiments and objects and so on. So I quite liked the idea of contrasting these two kind of wildernesses, if you like.
And it's interesting how you both refer to the internal wilderness and the external wilderness too. And I'm glad you brought up Conrad, because of course I think that's part of the problem in a way, that the heart of darkness, that Africa was considered the heart of darkness for so long. And I wonder whether, you know, as novelists, as writers, that's what you're trying to do as well, to bring light to that continent.
Look, the danger with Conrad is the same danger with Richard Kapuscinski, his fellow countrymate, you know, the Polish journalist. He called himself a journalist, but hey, was he really? He reported as factual many things that we now know were made up. So the danger with both men is that they were extraordinary writers. I enjoy reading Kapuscinski. I enjoy reading Conrad. I read Conrad first in German. I remember exactly where I was at the Library for Anglistics and Americanistics in 1997, because it was this extraordinary moment where because I read Thomas Mann, I read Siddhartha, and then I read Heart of Darkness, and I think I read Doris Lessing one after the other in German, and it made sense. So I have very vivid recollections. And then I read him in English, and it was much more shocking, interestingly, in English than it was in German. But at the same time, I couldn't help but admire that wonderful framing device that he uses, very similar to Wuthering Heights, where somebody's telling a story about somebody telling a story. Amazing as a writer, as a technician. But there was just something incredibly cold and an absence of humanity in the way that he wrote. And in fact, it was reading Chinua Achebe that made me believe that David Livingstone was worth writing about, because Achebe contrasts Conrad, born in a much more advanced time, to Livingstone, and looks at how they approach Africa. And he concludes that Livingstone, who was born in an earlier time, is the more human, right, than Conrad, who was born in a much later time. So yes, look, to me, Conrad was an important figure to push back against, but I cannot help but admire his craftsmanship as a writer.
Gyage, before we open up to the audience and find out whether there are any questions from the audience, what you're both doing is being Afro-European in your approach. And I think that's an incredibly important approach to literature and to life. And I wonder whether you feel this is now your mission. Is this something, did you just write this book and forget about it? Or is this something you've continued to pursue?
Yes, I think I want to continue this project, this kind of decolonization project. I want to write my next novel in some very similar topic about in my childhood. I lived behind the Iron Curtain, and in the street where I lived in a college girls and boys from different half socialist African countries, and there happened a tragic suicide among them. A boy and a girl committed suicide together, and I want to research their story, and I want to tell their story in the 70s of an Eastern European communist country. Guys who came from, I don't know the country's name where they came from, a half socialist under Soviet rule, and they came to Hungary to study, and what happened to them and why they committed suicide.
We'll come back to that. And I just wanted to find out from Veronica whether we have any questions from the audience, first of all.
Well, thank you, Rosie. First, I would like to apologize to Gyage because I didn't welcome you at the beginning. We're very happy to have you with us, so sorry for that. And second, Rosie, we've got two questions, but I think you already covered them in your discussion, so I'd just like to mention them to you. The first one was about cultural appropriation and the international discussions, which I think Bettina was already talking about. And the second question was about the writing of Soliman, and the question whether a European person, a person with European background, can write about a character like Soliman in case, and the question was whether your identity has influence on your writing and what difficulties showed up. But I also think that this was covered, Rosie, am I right?
Pretty much, but thank you very much for those questions. It's really important to know we have an audience out there. It's lovely to know we have an audience out there. It's lovely to have Veronica sitting there as well, looking after us. So what I'm going to do, though, is continue also to ask you both about this notion of being, back to this idea, who defines wilderness? And you've defined wilderness, I think, very well as writers. But if the rest of the question is it explorers, conquerors, refugees is an interesting aspect of this. Do refugees define wilderness?
Look, I think if you are one of those...
What do you think it means?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're one of those poor souls who is lost on the Atlantic and you're crossing from Africa, and you're trying to get to Europe, you've paid somebody all your life savings and you're trying to get to Europe, I think that crossing can be a form of terrifying, bewildering wilderness, you know. So I can see how refugees would define wilderness in that sense, but it's not a question that I'm entirely comfortable in addressing because I haven't really thought about it in enough details. The problem with being a writer promoting a book is that you are asked to, and this is one of my favorite words, you are asked to pontificate on the state of the world, on absolutely everything. But I think it's tempting to, you know, want to, you know, share.
I don't think that we need to pursue because in a way I just wanted to make sure that we, you know, I threw it out there if you had wanted to, because in a way from everything you've been telling me, I think I see you both more as explorers, really. So I'm going to sort of stick with you being explorers. And the other thing I want to bring is another wonderful quote which you made, Bettina, as well in an interview about being a frustrated historian. And I think you're both, I don't think you're frustrated, but you're both basically, you know, closet historians. And I want you to talk about the novelists as historians, because you are writing historical novels. Or this is a historical novel. You're, you know, both of you just discussing your historical novels. So do you see that as being an explorer? Gerge? Do you see
being
yourself,
an explorer?
well, as an historian,
As a historian, I think I found some interesting details, and I wrote my PhD about this topic, about the friendship of Angelo Soliman and Ferenc Kazinczy. And I thought really a few philological interesting things that new for the Hungarian literature history. But not as a historian, but exploring, for me, writing is exploring the topic itself. While writing, I explore what I cannot explore when I read the documents. Writing a character, writing a protagonist, to go with the protagonists and with the thoughts and with the emotions of the protagonist. You can find the crucial, the pivotal points of their decisions, the points where they could have gone in another direction, but they didn't do it. So I think this way of exploration, the literary exploration, sometimes much more important for me than that of the historical.
Now, you're a lawyer as well, and not only a lawyer as well, you are a very well-known lawyer. And I want, you know, to what extent does that compete with this fiction writing? Because you are a very, you do a lot of factual gathering, you do a lot of research, you've got that brain for that research, you know, and then here you are writing fiction. Is this, do they go together? They must do.
Perfectly compatible. They're perfectly compatible. I like to think of myself as left brain, right brain combined, right? And the way they're compatible, especially in view of my status, if I may call it that, as an amateur historian, is that I was very inspired by Hilary Mantel, who has a similar forensic approach to research that I adopted. And she says that the facts are immutable. The facts don't change. So the fact that David Livingstone died in the morning of 1 May 1873, I can't change that. What I can change, or what I can bring in, what I can liven up, is what his companions did when they found him, how they reacted and so on. I can't change the fact that they reached Bagamoyo in February of the next year, right? But I can fill in the gaps of what happened on that journey, right? And I can't make them take a route that they didn't take, because there were reasons that they took a particular route. So it's really my lawyer mind saying, don't mess with the facts, but my drama-loving writer mind saying, do try and give flesh to the bones, do try to resurrect the dead, you know. So that's how I reconcile it. And I'm so glad that you came across that quotation, because I do feel very much like history is where I'm going to be living for the next few books, because there's so much to talk about. And I really hope Gege will remain in touch, because I want to write to you about my project, which is about Portuguese exploration in Africa. So my next book after the one I'm writing is a 400-year history of the Mutapa Empire through fiction, which is a famous empire that was destroyed by the Portuguese, because of course the Portuguese were the first Europeans to encounter Southern Africa. You know, Bartolomeu Dias went around the Cape, Diego Cao found the Congo, and so on. So I want to look at that clash of civilizations that happened long before colonization. And I think I would love to talk to you about the Portuguese in Africa.
There you go. Maybe even a collaboration at some point.
maybe, hopefully.
It sounds really exciting. Now, you're both very anchored in place and location, and it's very important to the nature of what you write. Now, you're sitting in Zimbabwe at the moment. I know that you've been, offline writing, and you know, obviously writing. I don't know what you're writing, but you're writing about Zimbabwe. Is that right? Or or have you escaped into the wilderness just to write about anything?
I'm writing about the wilderness of Rhodesia. So the current book I'm writing is about 3 men, more or less the same age. I think the oldest is 10 years older than the youngest, and they're all brought together by the Second World War, because one is a refugee from Vienna, another loses his father, who's in the Rhodesian African Rifles in Tanganyika, in Burma, sorry, and another a white guy has a father who works for the Air Force. So there are these 3 loveless boys, right, who come together in fairly extraordinary circumstances. The Jewish Viennese boy becomes a lawyer who defends the black Rhodesian boy from the gallows, and the hangman is the white kid with a Scottish ancestry. In fact, his ancestry was from Yorkshire, right? But I found myself locked down in Edinburgh, and I had to change the whole backstory because all my books were in Harare. So I sort of like meet these 3 men at a very crucial point of Rhodesia's history. Their paths collide, and then they go out again. And it's something I've been thinking about for 10 years, and I'm finally writing it now. But the one I'm really excited about after this is the historical Portuguese Mutapa novel.
Goodness. So, and the fact that you were in Zimbabwe writing about it, did that make a difference to you about, where you actually write?
It really does, Rosie, because I like to write in the National Archives, because my books are, my most recent books are about the past, and I like to have that sense of history around me. And our archives are really old-fashioned. You have the catalogs that nothing is digitized. So you pull out a card, somebody brings out a manuscript and lays it reverently before you with white gloves on. You're not allowed to have ink and so on. And so one of the things I found in our archives was David Livingstone's astronomy journal. You can imagine the tears I shed when I actually held in my hands Livingstone's astronomy journal. So I like to write in the archives because that's really where I'm rooted. And I've been writing in the archives for about 10, 15 years now. So when I'm adrift from my books, from my archives, I feel a little bit lost, But, you try to write where you can, really.
Gage, what are you writing at the moment, and how important is it for you to be in this place in Central Europe, which is where you are, of course, Vienna, Budapest, all those places, I used to travel to Prague. It wasn't that long ago. It feels like a different life. But how important is it for you to be there when you're writing about Vienna, Budapest, Central Europe?
Until now, or until the recent year, it was very important, because there were serious questions about myself, about my family, about many questions about the history of Hungary, about Angelo Szojman and Ferenc Kazinczy. I wanted to write 5 books about these questions, which were very, very serious and important for me. But now I'm a little bit fed up with Eastern Europe, and we moved with my wife to Italy, and in the next few years, or I don't know how long, we want to live there, and I want to view back to my good old Central Europe from another perspective. I don't know what will happen, but I'm very curious about this project.
Now, this also brings, you're moving to Italy, so you're going to have another language to add to your collection. Let's talk about language, because it's absolutely fascinating. Here we are speaking in English. English is my native tongue, but I speak French and German and Italian as well. Gheorghe, you're Hungarian, German, English, and about to speak Italian, or you already speak Italian? Do you speak Italian?
Un pochissimo, sì.
Rosie?
Sto imparando.
Meglio che
Rosie?
niente, no? And Bettina, I heard this amazing thing. You actually learned Shona. You must have learned Shona as a child.
Yes.
Shona. And then English took over your life. Then you learned German because you lived in Austria and Berlin. And then you taught yourself Shona again? Or you refamiliarized?
No, it wasn't quite so dramatic happening. So, because I went to one of the first schools to be integrated after Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, we were a handful of Black kids that integrated in formerly all-white school. And I had been really excellent at Shona, composition, little plays and all that kind of thing. So I become 9 years old, we moved to this suburb with all these white kids. And my English is frozen because I don't have it, really. I mean, I could sort of like read it, but I couldn't, I wasn't fluent. We didn't really use English in the township. So for like 6 months, I was the most quiet child ever. And my reports were like, oh, she's so well behaved, but a little too quiet. And then I pick up English and I'm like, and I used to get sent out of the classroom all the time because I was always talking. And so finding English really freed me up in terms of reading and speaking and everything else, but it meant that my Shona was now frozen to the age of about 8. So then when I went to secondary school with my Dande and Din Don Do language, right, everybody mocked me, and my Rhodi accent, everybody mocked me. So I had to train myself back into my language and really, and I vowed to myself, because I don't like being defeated by small things, I vowed I would conquer this language. And I did, all the way up to A levels, so I'm now sort of an expert on the language, which I really find funny. And then, of course, I went to Austria, I learned German, I moved to Switzerland, I started speaking French. And to write this book, I had to pick up Swahili, at least to get the rhythm of the words, to understand what the key terms were, because I wanted to give as much verisimilitude as I could to the way that the men and the women spoke to each other, because they were a Swahili-speaking party. So I found myself with the extraordinary possibility and amazing opportunity of learning another African language that's not mine. It was wonderful.
And do you find that's made your literature better as well?
May I, for a moment, interrupt you, Rosie? Sorry for being impolite, but it's really a bit hard to step into your conversations. Okay, because a question has arrived, and this question is...
Yeah.
Fine, yeah. And this goes to Bettina, and it's the question whether you consider it important that European authors rediscover African history in a new way, and so that you can work on a gemeinsame Geschichte from both ends.
On a common history.
Right, exactly. This is the question.
Das ist sehr schön. Eine Gemeinsgeschichte ist sehr wichtig. So, I gave a talk.
Answer in English. They've got translators.
So I gave a talk to the Berlin Festival, the Berlin Literature Festival last year in 2019, and it was really one of the biggest honors of my life. And the theme of my talk was the European past is the African present. So what Europeans consider history, we consider current affairs, because that history, that scramble, what I call the power of Bismarck's ruler, 15 powers gathered in Berlin in 1884, carving up a continent. That's why we have all these straight lines all over Africa, because Bismarck simply drew a ruler like that. That history determines our fate today, and it continues to have an effect. So I love the idea of European writers and African writers having a conversation about what that past really means, both for Europe and for Africa. Because for Europe, it means, for instance, the thorny and very difficult question of reparations. What kind of reparations are we talking about for colonialism? Does it mean straightforward money, as the German government tried to do in Namibia? Or does it mean a more equitable form of reparations? For instance, what Macron is doing with repatriation of stolen loot, right? That's in Paris museums and museums in France, that is now going back to Africa. What does that reparations process look like? What about terms of trade? What about aid? So I think that this is a conversation that European writers and African writers can really come together to find common ground, because the European past really is the African present.
And
Thank you for that.
It's a great question, and it's also the time is right now. I mean, there's another wonderful book I'd like to suggest people read, called Afro-European by Johnny Pitts,
Yes.
which is, it is, and of course, as Britain is preparing to leave the EU, not to leave Europe, I hasten to add, I have no intention of leaving Europe ever, but we are about to leave the EU, and so these questions, which have been started, the balls have been rolling for so long. And, are we still going to be part of that wider European debate? I really hope so. I really hope so. Veronica, are there any more questions or?
No.
Great. Well, no, that's fine. Georgia, I will ask you also to respond to that, because that is at the heart of this discussion, is whether we can come up with an Afro-European project, if you like, and whether we should be aiming for that, and how we make up, how you, and I'm talking about us white people, can make up for the sins of the past, whether it's in literature, the arts, or reparations, practical ways.
I think we have many stories untold yet, and we have to discover the stories hidden in the past under the dust of not interesting about others, or about the stories of African in Europe. There are many stories of African people in Eastern Europe, even in the past. There are fantastic stories of people of African origin under the Ottoman Empire.